Thank you. Thank you so much for the generous introduction and certainly for the invitation. I'm humbled by your presence here. I'm happy to see a full house and certainly happy for the first time, I think, to be lecturing to an audience that is in some degree architecture, but also game design, right? My work certainly operates at an intersection of those two, and it's not often the case that I get to talk about architecture and game design in such a kind of a meaningful way. So hopefully this is of interest to you. So I've called this talk Entangled Simulations, and I want to start with my own rendition of what I'm calling entangled realism. This is a kind of a term that really came to me as I kind of moved here to Detroit a couple of years ago, and I visited Diego Rivera's murals here at the Detroit Institute of Arts. Rivera's work strikes incredibly important and reflects in many ways of many things that I would like to do with my work, right? It's a form of art that presents itself to a different audience, presents itself at a different scale, and attempts to do and depict, voices of the people that are looking at it. In many ways, the murals of Rivera do not obfuscate some of the realities that we see in everyday life. As you probably know, Rivera was part of one of the three large Mexican muralists, together with Orozco and Siqueiros, who took part of the technical syndicate of workers. And in that movement, there was a repudiation of forms of ultra-intellectual arts, favoring forms of public art that could actually have a social responsibility and perhaps an expression, not longer an expression of individual satisfaction, but perhaps having an educational force. Today, we certainly face a series of social challenges and struggles, both here in the US, in architecture, certainly the affordability crisis for housing comes present, and in Chile, my own country, I grew up and studied in Chile. We're going through a very profound social transformation, one that is kind of calling for a change of the constitution. So there's a lot of kind of reflections, and I wanted to share this with you, that can take part on the decisions of what kind of work and how do we engage with some of these issues within my creative research. Looking back at Rivera, there are kind of clues of certain perhaps values or things that we ought to keep on searching for, in my view. And I think that his Pan-American Unity mural in San Francisco talks about, how do we kind of bring back the celebration of indigenous pasts. In his time, discussing the emancipation of women and the celebration of how do we kind of maintain a tradition between the industrial power of the United States, but also the plastic tradition of Mexican culture. And what is that encounter between forms of technological progress that perhaps could not, reduce or silence traditions of craft that escape the mechanization, right? At the center of this mural, there is that encounter, right, between what we could describe the North and the South, an encounter between the goddess of life, which is half Indian, half machine. And in many ways, the kind of medium of a mural is capable to engage audiences in a different way. In Chile, again, within the midst of protests and social transformation, the use of painting off this different plazas has enabled a conversation about affordability of housing and engaging people to understand the economics behind forms of welfare. And as I mentioned here, this is certainly an urgent dialogue that is facilitated by an art that it's public facing, right? And I think that I rescue some of these traditions again in Rivera's murals. As mentioned, I'm the author of the book Architecture for the Commons, and I want to give you a quick introduction to what is presented in the book in case you don't have the time to go through it, but it certainly creates a foundation of how do I connect these ideas that perhaps could be argued for politics in a way, going through architectural notions of tectonics and how do we kind of create things with parts in many ways, to the point in which we actually think of games. And those things might feel very far apart if and so I want to really stitch them together within the framework of this book. So initially, I studied architecture under Patrick Schumacher, who is the director of Zaha Hadid Architects in London. And this was a time in which parametric design, a form of architectural design, really was booming, was kind of proliferating. And there was an ambition to kind of create a larger vocabulary of formal responses to the built environment. I think that this model was particularly flawed in many ways as a model of progress for the discipline. So I kind of really tried to problematize what should we strive for, what should we kind of define as architectural progress or design progress. There was a time in which Buckminster Fuller would argue for the model of ephemeralization. He uses this word to describe how physical systems gradually get lighter and lighter to the point in which they're almost invisible, right? If you can think about that process that happens with digital networks, we don't longer need cables, networks kind of disappear, and we're able to do that and even faster by a process of ephemeralization. In the views of Buckminster Fuller, this process of ephemeralization would lead to prosperity because we would be able to do more things with less resources, right? And that premise ultimately, I think, that didn't pan out. What we see is that perhaps we can do more, but that increases the profits of a few, and we maintain a degree of scarcity of resources or access to many others, right? What I see in industry, this is happening in design, not necessarily only in architecture, but we can see what I call a coalescence of parts, right? Industries like SpaceX or Tesla or large industries realize that the only way to optimize their production is for a practice that is called vertical integration. Vertical integration is the process by which industries own a vertical monopoly. They own the extraction of resources all the way to the delivery to the consumer. And in such a way, they can create an ecosystem that optimizes the conversation that those different entities would have with one another. While this model proves to be highly efficient to the point in which it could actually create 3D printed rocket engines, it is highly problematic in the way in which establishes a form of industrial design that does not include multi-actor economy, right? It's actually concentrating all the control and power within a vertical. So what we could see in design is a process by which what before used to be several parts, those are coalescing with one another and to a form that arguably it's more optimized, but it's optimized for efficiency and it's optimized perhaps for economics, but it's not optimized for the social capability of industries to proliferate. In architecture, we see similar trends that ultimately are a dissolution of tectonics, right? What before would have been a series of ingredients and parts that come together, they are coalesced into monolithic, larger forms. So you can see this in design in the work of Zaha Hadid architects and others that have used this form of 3D printing or kind of depositing of material to have gradients that ultimately create monolithic objects. In the case of phones like iPhones that you might have, you can see that the obfuscation of interiors through proprietary parts such as the pentalobe screw that you can see on the screen, these are copyrighted technologies that are called anti-tampering technologies. So it's really stopping you from opening that phone, as the right to repair movement has pointed out, and repairing it in an inexpensive manner, right? So the vertical integration model is trying to kind of really concentrate the service of repairs, the way in which you engage with that object, and really completely keep the object as a black box. So I find that problematic, and I developed what I call a defense of parts, right? While we traditionally think of parts perhaps in a jigsaw puzzle form, right, where you can actually organize different elements into a larger whole, I argue for a open topology model, which is certainly closer to, maybe you're familiar with Legos, right? And that model, which I'm going to show this project in a bit, is the Bloom project, has been instrumental for me to develop particular forms of architectural design propositions that remain open-ended in their outcome. Other projects such as Gilles Retzin's work, which is featured in the book, also kind of start thinking of design as parts that could have life outside the projects that are actually instantiated in a particular case, right? And if we have parts that could be recombined in many different ways, that could allow for multiplicity of architectures, perhaps there are different kind of software or perhaps different forms or different media that would allow us to reorganize those parts collectively and perhaps finding patterns that we all kind of agree or kind of have a certain interest for. This was actually pioneered by architect Jonah Friedman in 1967 with the concept of flat writer. This was software, not executed as such, but conceptualized as a software that would allow for the recombination and reorganization of a megastructure. Today, we do have mediums such as video games that are capable for a large crowd of audience and public to engage with different forms of production, right? We can see on the left the example of Folded, which is a video game for protein folding, creating protein folding solutions, which has been linked to the advancement of science. And City Skylines, arguably, it's accurate enough to really kind of give renditions of different cities. The documentary Game in the Real World, which I was participating as well, showcase how City Skylines among Minecraft and other games are really attempting to kind of bridge the gap between video games and reality, right? My own work, which I'm going to display here today with Blockhood and Commonhood, is an attempt to really establish a dialogue, not perhaps a literal dialogue between reality and the real world, reality and the game world, but rather kind of expand the kind of mechanisms that we have to reorganize parts and participate on an economy that requires inputs from different perspectives and not perhaps the kind of centralized decision-making that is allowed by vertical integration. I argue that this actually enables a commons, right? And that's a central word in the book to describe not perhaps what traditionally was a kind of common pool of resources in physical terms, but rather the stewardship of a community and the digital resources that community is kind of developing, as we can see in some cases in the open source movement and in some physical communities in the case of Open City in Chile, which is one of the examples that I use in the book. But I really want to anchor some of those ideas in projects that I've developed in my studio, the Plethora project, right? So I really want to take you back to the project Bloom, which was my first intuition that games would actually make a case for a participatory logic and use a kind of a play as kind of adding a question mark to the kind of architecture that was being presented. Bloom, it's a interactive installation developed for the London Olympics, and it starts from a digital fabrication process called injection molding that allows us to stamp very quickly and very inexpensively identical units. That's kind of key because the affordability of the units is the only way in which you could get this amount of units that we have ultimately produced. And here, the design really comes by the organization of those identical parts. Those parts actually, as you can see, are asymmetric, and each connection point would actually lead to a branching pattern in different trajectories. So it's quite difficult to simulate, and it's quite difficult to anticipate what people would do with it, right? So as you can see, we might be able to present an installation and say, hey, this is a pavilion developed by us, the design team, and we did so in several locations. But at the same time, the game lends itself to an audience, right? How would people interact with it at different scales? What are the kind of games that you can play with it as an individual, but also as a collective? And what are the patterns? Sometimes, building structures, sometimes organizing enclosures that cater for the kind of the local contingent interest of a crowd when the project is presented, right? As you can see, every time that we present the game, it really takes different forms and it adapts to the interest of that public. In many ways, the patterns that emerge from the game, we were documenting them as tokens of participation, and at the same time, form data aggregations that had that were kind of very transient, right? They were not a kind of an ultimate form of the project to be documented as a building, but rather kind of a transient form of kind of organization. And as you can see, we use the game also for education, thinking how the game can really help kids to think about logic and in a playful way, right? And in many ways, the reflection with a game like Bloom was that having a public project for the Olympics was great. There was a large number of audience that is capable to engage with such a thing, but it's not large enough in a way for the kind of permutations or mathematical permutations that is allowed by the game, right? Bloom was a game that was slightly flexible, so people would be able to bend and break the rules quite easily. So the universe of possibilities allowed by the system was quite vast. And I realized that, this is a trajectory of research that I wanted to engage further. How does public participation engage with computational systems? And obviously we know that games are kind of a medium that has been doing that for a while, right? Games have been equipped with the tools to engage in a similar kind of logic digitally. So that led me to start a studio in the Bartlett, which is School of Architecture in London, where we use games as a medium to think about architecture. This is a studio called Gamescapes in 2013. And it was really inspired by things like Minecraft and other games like The World of Goo that were out at the time, thinking how do you construct something that would harness energy or that would actually be kind of an open-ended building system out of little blocks, right? These were never released. Producing a game professionally takes, as you probably know, an important amount of effort. So the prototypes really were kind of instrumental to be thinking about architecture and game design, but yeah, certainly didn't see the light of day in terms of formal releases. But I did decide to embark on that journey myself with my first project called Blockhood. And Blockhood was, no, I'm just gonna maybe leave you with this video while I describe it. Blockhood was my first professional video game. It really kind of looked at the subject matter of architecture in the context of city building games. The catch was certainly to kind of make a small project, the first video game project, thinking of how do I kind of compress the logics of a city building game within one city block. And with that argument, I could bring forward an ecological argument, which is, what if you didn't have a place to outsource your waste? What if you didn't have a place that would kind of send you energy, right? Which is perhaps our kind of natural condition. I would think of cities like energy is produced somewhere else, food is produced somewhere else. We just purchase it in the supermarket, and waste is kind of disappears, right? So if you ought to kind of design a city block that considers those problems within that block, what would that look like? So the game offers the player around 190 tiles or blocks, each one of them with specific kind of requirements of resources that operate as inputs and outputs. So in many ways, each tile is related to every other tile in an ecological network, right? You gradually create your own problems. There's no kind of demand for the player to build any tile initially. You can just do what you want. But every tile that you introduce, it would actually have a specific demand with itself. So you kind of have to taper your own ambitions as you play the game and as you create something that you find an interesting habitat. The game has a second mechanic of entropy, and that has to do with how each tile, if it's not satisfying its variables or their kind of input requirements, would gradually deteriorate to the point of collapse and it would die, right? So you are kind of, the gameplay that emerges is that you have to maintain this kind of beating heart. You have to maintain your neighborhood alive just by making sure that you're providing the right resources for the tiles that you're creating, right? So those tiles will take a while to gradually decay and deteriorate, but if they start doing so, it might kind of create a chain reaction to the point in which you might end up in this dystopian abandoned building, which you probably seen some images of. So you're constantly kind of moving between this utopia of what we can build. There's no kind of cost to build anything, right? I remove completely the need of paying a cost to build a structure. The only thing that is relevant is how do you maintain that entity over time, right? And that is achieved by the interplay of resources that comes from tile to tile. I'm going to talk about the narrative in a minute. There is a kind of a story mode, which is maybe a bit of a glorified tutorial, but certainly the aspect of narrative became a kind of a pivotal point, especially towards the thinking of a next game. So this is how the project Block actually started. This was a workshop that I did in 2014 in Hong Kong with a few friends. We call it Block. It was a very crude prototype where it would be a 4-player game, and it took a couple of months to build. And the response was positive to the point in which I decided to kind of take that project professionally and develop it. And it took 3 years to be finished. And at the core of the model is, as I mentioned, this kind of ecological diagram of the exchange of resources. That allows you to really model different kind of production systems. If you want to model the industrial food production system, you might want to use a particular set of tiles, a subset of tiles versus an organic food production system. There is no right or wrong in the game. That is, in a way, brought by the player of what you want to do. The tiles are there, right? Some tiles produce pollution. Some of them would actually have a different kind of impact, right? You are the one discovering the consequences of your decisions. And the kind of calculations that happen in the background have to do with synergies between tiles. I'm a big fan of games such as Magic the Gathering, where you see that every entity or every card in a game can actually have synergies and kind of relationships with others. So there's kind of quite an inexhaustible way of combining the pieces in many different ways, right? The data that is presented to the player informs, and it might anticipate something like the collapse of a building, showing structure data, access data, decay, what are the tiles that are about to burst, and production, which are the tiles that are actually executing correctly and which ones are not. At the core of the game is also a critique to optimization, right? There is no score, there is no right way of playing Blockhood. There are only patterns. There's only responses that are kind of personal and contingent to a biome, to a particular interest of a player. And I fought quite, strongly to introduce any mechanic that would unify or kind of would allow players to optimize for what is better than something else, right? Because in a way, my perspective on that had to do that I didn't want to create convergence of outcomes. I wanted to celebrate the diversity of outcomes that could emerge out of players' interest. And that could have been a big mistake in a way. I think it was a costly one in terms of like how players sometimes gravitate to want more explicit objectives within a game, and how do you ultimately achieve a sense of proliferate difference, right? Which is a question that I keep coming back to even in my current projects. So I want to think that Blockhood is an open design system, one that allows different, building types and different kind of neighborhood models, as you can see in some of these images. As I mentioned before, you are kind of, this is kind of the dystopian look of how, every tile would have a version of itself in decayed state. And the narrative, which as I mentioned, came very late in the game, had a certain part to be a tutorial or an education to the player of how you play the game, but it really started taking life of its own in terms of really being able to say different things that the foundational mechanics of the game originally were not able to tackle. And I think that that's what I want to discuss in my next project. These are some of the images of the setting, how Blockhood has been used also for education, thinking about ecological systems, and an entry point for perhaps an audience that has grown up playing Minecraft and wants to kind of maybe connect how architecture and games maybe are connected, and certainly Blockhood it's a point of entry that it's informed by some of the questions that architecture has been having as a discipline. So This leads me to this final project that is a project that I've been working on for 5 years and really kind of takes me to the title of this talk, which is entitled Simulations. And this is a kind of a new argument that I've been trying to put together for a conference soon. So let's see how it goes. It's kind of first time kind of presenting this. So I'm excited to see what you think. In many ways, a project such as Commonhood reflects and interacts with some of the readings of Octavia Butler. In The Parallel of the Software, Octavia Butler presents an exacerbated reality, one that kind of maximizes or kind of exalts the logics of survival, right? It's a dystopian take on our reality that makes survival kind of an imperative mode of living. But in a way, for Butler's characters, the logics of survival, the instrumental logic of survival, it's not enough to define their kind of interactions. There needs to be something else, and that is clearly evident in our main character, Eulamina, who actually develops her own religion, right, called Earthseed, and one that is, in a way, has a conversation with current existing religions, right? For Butler, there's, in my view, there's two opposing ontologies. An ontology of the economy, one that has a logic of resource manipulation. How do we get profit? How do we maintain ourselves alive through economics? And another one that perhaps grasps or kind of escapes the computational aspect, right? One that is more human, one that allows for narratives between people to emerge and that defines what we could actually call meaning. So the first one, the first ontology, I want to just kind of frame it here. It's a kind of a fancy word to say who has a voice in a model, right? Like who has a voice in the model that we're explaining, right? And an economic model, as you can see in these beautiful diagrams by Joris Dormas, who has a beautiful game design book using the software machinations for introducing concepts of economy, or as Scott Page has presented it in system dynamics. It's a way of anticipating how a system would actually behave over time. And it's a kind of a quantitative analysis. You can do quite advanced analysis. This is kind of a whole analysis of the game of Pac-Man, again done by Joris Dormas on his book. And in a way, that takes us closer to the world of digital twins, which again is much closer to architecture. And digital twins has been adopted by several industries like AnyLogic, this is software for digital twins, or NVIDIA, as the current stage of affairs of how computational systems should create a correlation with digital ones, right? Or digital systems with reality, right? It makes sense to have a digital twin that will anticipate issues in a production line, and that could be highly costly, right? So it's becoming more and more of a norm to kind of have such models in place. This is not particularly new. In the 70s, again, within my Chilean background, I was aware of the project Cyberscene, which is an interesting experiment documented by Erin Medina in her book, Cybernetic Revolutionaries. The project Cyberscene was implemented in the 70s as a cybernetic experiment of how the Chilean economy would actually administrate and balance its resources. Many have criticized this project for trying to be kind of a totalitarian form of control, but as argued by Medina and Stafford Beer, who was the cybernetician behind the project, this was actually not the case. There was a kind of a dialogue, a feedback loop, let's say a thermostat effect between this form of twin, or this form of software, and how the economy was operating, right? A form of regulation. And for a long time, I think that computational systems have gravitated to really think of themselves as how can we make a system that is scalable, right? Or how do we kind of universalize some of the principles of computation so that these would actually resolve not this just particular problem, but it would actually resolve many problems along the lines, right? And I think that this mentality of scalability is one that certainly should be problematized, and it has been done so by anthropologists, and I think really revealing how scalability requires for elements of the project to be oblivious of certain undeterminacies, right? Or perhaps how scalability banishes a sense of meaningful diversity between a system, right? She's not necessarily saying that scalability is bad, right? But it's scalability is an effort that is quite central and different from a non-scalable approach that is perhaps more ethnographic or kind of local in its capacity to engage the world. If we look at a different kind of twin, the work of artist Jeremy Deller, who, in 2001 developed the project, the reenactment of the Battle of Orgrave, we can think of this second ontology perhaps in a more palpable way, right? Deller develops this reenactment, including over 1,000 people, where there's a different form of cognition. There's no kind of resources coming in and out, but there's really kind of the enaction as a form of cognition. And this is a term that has been described by Arturo Escobar, who has been very influential in my way of looking at computational systems. In many ways, social narratives kind of can operate perhaps in the clash or encountering narratives that operate at the level of economies and at the level of computation, right? As Escobar points out in his book Design for the Pluriverse, he kind of recalls that perhaps we have to be thinking of systems that include us, right? And that might seem obvious, but at the same time, it has been quite controversial to do so, because as he reminds us, this is dismantling the principle of objectivity, right? The moment that we think ourselves as within a system, as second order cybernetics would invite us to think of them, we become entangled in a simulation, and perhaps the object of such a simulation could not be considered objective, right? I think that games have been able to do this in an interesting way. Maybe many of you have played this game called Papers, Please. And I think Papers, Please presents this kind of clash of ontologies in an interesting way. As you maybe know, you play as a guard in a border condition between two fictitious countries, and it's in your hands to really let people pass that border. The logic of your job as the guard, it's pretty straightforward. You have to find fakes or kinds of reasons for approval, and you can stamp approve or deny, right? So until that point, the logics of your job is pretty clear. The game kind of changes the moment that you realize that as a guard, you also have a family, and that you have to kind of sustain in many ways. And the social narratives that emerge in the game actively starts persuading you to act against your own self-interest. So there's an encounter between two ontologies, right? One that is socially narrativized, and another one that is kind of mechanical and explicit in the logic of economy. And that has certainly been an analysis as a point of departure to develop a new game, a project that I've been working for the past 5 years called Commonhood, that really builds a lot more on the narrative aspect and the setting, as opposed to a kind of a universal system. So I'm going to play this video while maybe describe a bit the project. So Commonhood, it's a community building and architecture crafting game. There's perhaps could be described as a squatter simulation, where you join a community of squatters in an abandoned building, and it's in your hands to kind of reconstruct some form of economy or some form of prosperity, right? You do so by learning how to craft and creating systems that would expand your capabilities, right? Unlike any other software platform where you would actually design, let's say, architecture or environments, the setting of Commonhood is dominated by scarcity. So you do not have infinite amount of lines or beams or resources to build things, but rather you have to salvage material, process it, cut the wood, and ultimately be able to deploy it for something that you could call architecture, right? So it really tries to subvert the paradigm of abundance that we seem to be offered as the default paradigm for computational design in mostly every package that I can think of. And it exchanges that for one that is slightly or a lot more slower in the way in which we get to design, but perhaps one that is more aware or of the steps that are required in order to put a particular design forward. So this project wants to think, well, where is architecture conceived? What are the spaces and the environments that that define the kind of the architectural imaginaries that we are kind of putting ahead, right? The game starts in an eviction. Our main character, Nikki, is kind of dispossessed from her childhood home, and again, occupies this post-industrial factory, which in many ways is a metaphor for a generation that had great ambitions about the future and a model of prosperity that didn't really pan out, right? In many ways, it's environmentally saying a lot of the things that I've been writing in my book, right? So the new family that Nikki has to build within this space has to find a different form of kind of economic value or kind of forms of value to care about, right? The game certainly presents a matrix of items that could be processed through machines, that could be converted into different form of decorations or meaningful elements within the space, and it can really offer divergent trajectories for players to produce different environments for their inhabitation, right? From being more of a botanist, perhaps, or a tailor, among many others, right? As I mentioned, the game is mediated by scarcity, specifically in the scarcity of resources, the availability to tools, which are some crafted and some bought, the availability to knowledge, which is also represented in the form of blueprints, and the availability to labor, which is your own as a player, but also one that is complemented both by members in your community, but also robots or forms of automation that you might unlock at certain point, right? Our kind of status effect system really kind of tries to present the NPCs, the characters of the game, not as pure automatons that are kind of performing a job for you, but rather entities that have their own life story. There's kind of narrative arcs to each one of them. None of them are generic in many ways, but they have their own internal behavior, right? And again, this is a critique to games that operate under the premise of a God game, right? Like if you're familiar with games, again, God games is a genre that has been very popularized by projects such as, started by Populous and Sandbox Games and others that really put the player in a hierarchical position over the world in which it's operating, right? Alternatively, board games that I love as well, like Agricola or Caverna, are kind of in a tradition of worker placement games that again look at the human as a resource to execute construction or expansion, right? In digital games, we can see tycoon games, perhaps expanding on that tradition of how the growth of a factory or the growth of a startup really is an economic endeavor, and often, or not very often, to be honest, looks into the inner lives of some of those workers, right? But certainly we do have games that have a degree of complexity, where the psychology of the dwarves in Dwarf Fortress or the kind of emotional condition of your community within games like Rimworld or Prison Architect perhaps offers us a more complex depiction of what game rules can actually yield. In Commonhood, again, inspired by such models, the emotional state of NPCs certainly kind of might create a pushback to the player, to the point in which you might feel, or hoping that you feel, that you're entangled in the simulation as opposed to a ruler or a kind of a god within it. At the core of this interrogation comes also questioning models that are very well established within industry. Like Will Wright was always kind of interested of how and discussed, I think, in a lecture by Richard Evans, on how the Maslow hierarchy of needs is implemented within the kind of the AIs of NPCs within the sims, and really having at the pinnacle of that pyramid self-actualization. Is that something that is established, or is that something that a community can arrive at as a collective endeavor, or perhaps question, the tier by which community and collective enterprises might also be at an equal footing, right? So the model of NPC certainly has in mind some of these conditions, right? As beautifully articulated by Jenny Odell, we ought to be thinking not only of workers in their productive state, but perhaps we ought to think of conditions that are, how do we model the unproductive? And what is the life outside our kind of intentions for productivity, right? So in a way, the NPCs and the design of the project tries to kind of create this kind of push and pull relationship with the player. Again, these are some images of the game, which is still in development. The larger idea of the project is that players, after kind of engaging with the initial narrative, will be able to engage with the production and the stewardship of a digital commons, right? One that is allowed for the sharing of resources and the sharing of knowledge. This is our kind of architectural modeling environment where you can see designs. This is kind of one that has been built by some of us devs, but it's open to anybody to build blueprints within the game and share those with one another online. We also have an online multiplayer system where people can like jump together into a factory and design the kind of architecture that you might want to consider relevant for the game, right? So it really offers us an ecology of labor, one that is kind of co-populated by players, but also different entities within digital fabrication setting. Right? When we think about automation and robotics, it's with a question mark. Those technologies are not taken for granted. There's a kind of a big investment that the player has to take in order to acquire one of these robots, so or craft them. So, and how more efficient and what are the kind of capabilities of those robots in relationship to other kind of human counterparts, right? So again, the invitation is to really kind of expand the vision. The game is opening up a door of what players would actually produce within this space. We certainly have our own ideas of it, but it's certainly an open-ended tool for architectural exploration in a gaming setting. Just looking ahead, my interest is to kind of really shift the narrative from a design that is mediated by abundance to one that is mediated by scarcity, simulating labor that considers both the productive and unproductive, the kind of inner life of NPCs in many ways. How do we incentivize the construction of online commons and communities that have stewardship for their value or the meaning that they're producing online? How do we make architectural knowledge accessible and shareable? And I think that we have, like, a part that I didn't share with you is how blueprints within the game are kind of a take on how do you encapsulate architectural knowledge, right? And how is that potentially shared? I'm also interested in how do we track provenance, meaning origin of decision making, and give people credit for work that they have done, right? You might download a blueprint and you might have like, this has been iterated by 10, 20 people before you. So there's a sense of like authorship and reciprocity that could be fostered within a digital community. And certainly a fair recognition of the value of those creators. I want to finish with a quote by Donna Haraway, who describes the word symbiosis, which is quite important for me. So symbiosis is a simple word. It means making with. Nothing makes itself. Nothing is really autopoietic or self-organizing. And with that, I will leave it there. Thank you.